In a crowded courtroom, a stray dog suddenly enters, its three measured barks capturing everyone's attention and breaking the expected order. The dog, with a thin, battered coat, boldly sits in the center as its eyes seem to communicate a silent, urgent message.
In a moment that felt as if time itself had slowed to a tender pause, a tiny key attached to its collar caught the light in a way that transformed a seemingly ordinary object into a symbol of secret truths, yearning to be revealed. And as the stray dog, worn by the hardships of a wandering life, yet imbued with an undeniable nobility, stepped into the crowded courtroom, its presence stirred a turbulent mixture of confusion, hope, and wistful yearning in the hearts of everyone present. For that glimmering key was not merely a piece of rusted metal, but a silent messenger carrying the weight of hidden histories, untold stories, and buried sorrows waiting to be unearthed. It shimmered with a quiet intensity that evoked memories of lost days, and with each subtle flicker of light that danced upon its surface, it spoke of fragile trust betrayed and of the possibility that even the most overlooked details in our lives could hold the power to unravel mysteries built on layers of deception and heartache. Layers that, when peeled away, revealed a deeper truth about human fragility and the unexpected moments of grace that sometimes come from the most unassuming sources. As the courtroom's atmosphere shifted from one of sterile formality to something more raw and achingly human, the judges, lawyers, witnesses, and onlookers alike found themselves drawn into a narrative that transcended the confines of legal arguments, resonating instead on an emotional level that touched upon themes of redemption and the bittersweet beauty of discovering that even in our darkest hours, there exists a glimmer of hope, symbolized by the simple presence of this key, which seemed to carry within its delicate shape the collective memories of those who had suffered and yet continued to love and believe in the possibility of new beginnings. It became a metaphor for the hidden corners of our souls, where secrets lie dormant until the right moment, when a gentle creature, much like the humble dog now standing at the heart of the unfolding drama, appears to nudge us toward truth and understanding, urging us to look beyond the surface of our everyday trials and to discover the profound connections that bind us all through shared experiences of pain, resilience, and the search for meaning in a world that can often seem indifferent to our struggles. In that single luminous moment, when the key's light caught the eye of a weary juror, it stirred within them a deep and unspoken longing for justice. Not just the cold, hard justice dictated by law, but the tender, healing justice that comes from acknowledging the scars of the past and embracing the possibility that every hardship, every abandonment, and every moment of quiet despair might one day lead to a revelation that transforms lives and rekindles the human spirit. It was as if the universe had conspired to deliver this modest token at the precise moment when hope appeared to be waning, reminding everyone present that truth has a way of emerging from even the smallest, most seemingly insignificant details, and that much like the stray dog whose unassuming presence had upended the very proceedings of the day, each of us may harbor within us a secret strength, a resilience born from our deepest wounds, waiting patiently to be called forth into the light. So here, in the midst of legal formalities and the clamor of a crowded room, the tiny key became a beacon, a silent herald of the idea that the journeys we take, no matter how convoluted or fraught with adversity, are not in vain, that every neglected corner of our lives might eventually be illuminated by the unexpected glow of truth, and that even when the world seems cold and indifferent, the smallest acts, a stray animal's determined bark, a key that glimmers against the stark fluorescence of a courtroom, can remind us all that there is beauty and grace in revelation, healing in honesty, and ultimately a quiet promise that every hidden truth, no matter how deeply buried, has the power to change our lives forever, inviting us to believe again in the simple, profound magic of redemption and renewal, and to carry forward with renewed courage the knowledge that every fragment of our experience, every small gesture of fate, can come together to weave a tapestry of life that is as intricate and irreplaceable as the delicate shine of that very key, urging us to never lose faith in the beauty that arises even from the humblest beginnings, reminding us that sometimes the most transformative truths are revealed by the most unassuming of messengers, and that in the great unfolding drama of life, every single detail, no matter how small, holds within it the potential to unlock the deepest secrets of the human heart. Judge Martha Campbell had presided over countless trials in her long and storied career, each day marked by procedure, decorum, and the measured rhythm of the law. Her gavel a symbol of control in a world where chaos often lurked just outside the courthouse doors. And in all that time, she had never once faltered, not in the face of rage from a guilty defendant, not when witnesses broke down in tears on the stand, not even when public outcry surged like a storm beyond the courthouse walls. But today something was different, something that touched a part of her she had long kept hidden beneath robes of duty and decades of hardened resolve. Because in the midst of the courtroom's daily grind, the dog of all things had entered, not with fear or confusion, but with calm purpose, its paws tapping softly on the cold tiles as it moved through the room like it belonged. And when it stopped in the very center, its eyes sweeping the faces of the stunned audience, and barking 3 times with unnerving precision, Judge Campbell, who prided herself on her ability to maintain order even in the most heated legal battles, found herself frozen, not in fear or anger, but in awe. The sight of the key on the dog's collar catching the courtroom lights and sending flickers across the walls like the past illuminating the present, and in that moment a profound stillness settled over her, as memories long buried began to stir. For beneath the stern exterior and tightly held authority, Martha was a woman who had once believed deeply in stories, in symbols, in the mysterious ways the world revealed itself, and though she had spent years training herself to value only facts, evidence and testimony, she couldn't shake the feeling that this dog, this unlikely dusty creature had come, not to disrupt, but to guide, to offer a truth that law books alone couldn't explain. And so she didn't reach for her gavel right away, didn't bark orders to remove the animal, didn't demand the court return to its scheduled proceedings, because for once her instincts, those quiet ancient voices buried under years of professional detachment, whispered that there was meaning here, that she needed to listen, to look, to feel, and perhaps for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to do just that, to simply be present, to bear witness without judgment, as the room collectively held its breath, and as she studied the dog, its worn frame, its steady gaze, its unshakable stillness, she felt something rise within her, not just curiosity, but something closer to reverence, as though this animal were the bearer of a message older and deeper than any courtroom transcript. And her thoughts briefly wandered to her father, who had once told her, when she was just a child, and the world still seemed full of wonder, that justice isn't always loud, that sometimes it speaks in quiet moments, in unexpected guests, in strange symbols that appear without warning. And as the bailiff reached the dog and knelt to retrieve the key, her heart beat, not with anxiety, but with anticipation, a part of her daring to hope that this key might not only unlock a physical space tied to the case at hand, but also a hidden truth, something purer than the grey morality she often saw debated in this very room. And when the dog locked eyes with the defendant, David Hollis, a man whose polished appearance could not hide the cracks beginning to form, she saw a flicker of something dark and fearful in his eyes, and she knew, instinctively, that this was no coincidence, that fate or faith or something else entirely had stepped in. Though her courtroom was built on order, on rules, on timelines and testimony, in that moment, none of that mattered as much as the quiet understanding dawning in her chest. And so when she finally spoke, her voice did not carry its usual command, but something more weighted, more human, more raw, as she told the bailiff to secure the dog, her hands trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that she was no longer simply judging a case, but standing at the edge of something far more profound, something that reached into the very heart of justice itself, into the invisible threads that bound this dog to the defendant, to the key, to the truth that had waited patiently in the shadows, until this exact moment. And she thought, perhaps this is what justice looks like, not always clean, not always explained, but sometimes delivered in ways that defy logic, and leave even the most seasoned hearts cracked open with wonder. And in that courtroom, under the harsh fluorescent lights and watchful eyes of the public, Judge Martha Campbell, for the first time in many years, allowed herself to feel, not just the weight of the law, but the fragile beauty of the unknown, the sacred mystery of timing, and the haunting reminder that justice is not only about what we can prove, but what we are willing to believe, when something greater than us moves into the room, and demands to be seen. As the echo of the dog's final bark faded into the still air, a strange, almost invisible transformation began to take place within the courtroom, a slow unraveling of certainty that crept like a chill through every row of seated observers. But it was most noticeable at the defense table, where David Hollis, once the picture of calm confidence, began to shift uncomfortably in his seat, his polished facade cracking under the weight of something no one could yet name. His eyes, which had moments earlier scanned the room with arrogance and composure, now darted nervously between the dog sitting upright and silent on the floor, and the key that now dangled in the air like an accusation suspended on a chain of fate. And though no words had yet been spoken, the atmosphere had undeniably changed. The charged silence speaking volumes louder than any testimony, louder than any objection, and it was in that silence that doubt began to take root. Not just in the minds of the jurors and the spectators, but deep within the hearts of Hollis's own legal team, who exchanged uneasy glances and subtle nods, the kind of wordless communication that passed between people when something unspoken but undeniable had just entered the room. And even Carter, the sharp-suited defense attorney known for his stoic demeanor and commanding presence, seemed rattled, clearing his throat and shifting his notes with hands that trembled ever so slightly, as if trying to grasp hold of the procedural structure they had so carefully built, but now felt slipping like sand through their fingers. For this was not in the script, this was not a cross-examination or a motion or an argument they could file against. This was something else, something primal, something that made the hairs stand up on the back of one's neck, because it came not from the mouth of a witness, but from the unknown, from something as improbable as a stray dog walking into a courtroom at the exact moment the prosecution was preparing to lay down its closing blow. And yet here it was, and here they were, and suddenly the questions they had spent months preparing for no longer felt like enough. Suddenly the alibis felt weaker, the timelines suspicious, the truth more fragile than they had imagined. And though they tried to maintain their composure, to whisper reassurances to one another, to straighten papers and recheck evidence folders, their collective discomfort betrayed them, because nothing in law school had prepared them for this, for the creeping dread that now wrapped itself around their strategy, like a vine twisting around a crumbling wall. And as the whispers in the audience grew louder, more curious, more hungry for answers, so too did the sense that something had shifted irreversibly, that the courtroom had become more than a legal battleground. It had become a place where unseen forces had begun to tip the scales, and Hollis, the man at the center of it all, began to feel the full weight of that shift. His face turned pale, beads of sweat beginning to form at his temple, and he leaned in toward Carter, whispering something urgent, something tight and panicked. But Carter could only nod stiffly, because even he knew deep down that whatever happened next was no longer something they could fully control. And when the dog suddenly turned its head to stare directly at Hollis, holding his gaze with eyes that seemed far too knowing, too steady, too certain, the moment became almost unbearable, as if every hidden sin, every buried truth, every carefully constructed lie was being silently confronted by a creature that should have no place in a courtroom but now seemed to own it. And the tension, thick and unrelenting, became a pressure on everyone's chest, a silent question hanging in the air. What did the dog know? What was it trying to reveal? And why now? And while logic insisted it was only a coincidence, that a stray animal could not possibly understand the complexities of embezzlement or legal proceedings, the heart whispered otherwise. The heart said that some things defy explanation, that sometimes truth finds its way into the light through the most improbable of messengers. And it was this quiet, persistent whisper that began to echo louder and louder in the minds of the jurors, the spectators, even the journalists clutching their pens with newfound urgency, scribbling down notes not just about the proceedings, but about the strangeness of it all, the unsettling beauty of a moment that no one could have predicted. And it was in that space between disbelief and wonder that suspicion began to bloom, slowly but steadily, and it bloomed in the gaze of a judge, who suddenly looked less like an enforcer of law, and more like a seeker of something deeper, something just out of reach. And it bloomed in the quiet gasps of the room, as people leaned forward, unknowingly holding their breath, as though expecting the dog to speak, to move, to somehow confirm their growing sense that this was no accident, that this creature had arrived with purpose. And though it never uttered another sound, the message had already been delivered. Something was wrong, something was hidden, and someone in this room already knew it. And from that moment forward, every glance toward Hollis, every subtle twitch of his lip, every glance toward the key was filtered through the lens of growing suspicion. And suddenly the jury didn't just see a businessman on trial, they saw a man being watched by a force he didn't understand, a force he couldn't control. And in the eyes of the dog, silent and still, and impossibly present, They began to see not a random animal, but the symbol of something far greater, something ancient and relentless, the pursuit of truth. Prosecutor Elaine Morgan sat perfectly still for a moment, her fingertips gently resting on the surface of her desk, eyes fixed not on her notes or the witness stand, but on the key that now glinted faintly in the fluorescent courtroom light, dangling from the bailiff's careful grip. And as the murmurs swelled again through the crowd and even the judge sat momentarily speechless, Elaine felt something stir within her, not the kind of reaction born from strategy or training, but something deeper, older, a quiet certainty rising in her chest that this was not a coincidence, that this key, delivered by the most unlikely of messengers, was not just evidence, it was a call to act. Her mind, usually so focused on the logical progression of a case, now seemed to open wider, embracing possibility, even mystery, because when she looked at that dog, calmly seated near the defense table, as if it belonged there all along, she felt a pull, a whisper from her gut, telling her that sometimes the truth doesn't knock politely, it bursts through doors, covered in dirt and silence, and waits to be recognized. And so, with a breath that steadied the sudden rush of urgency she felt, Elaine stood, her voice firm but calm as she addressed Judge Campbell, requesting permission to examine the key more closely. And though the request was unconventional, the judge nodded, perhaps sensing what Elaine herself was beginning to realize, that some truths are revealed only when you are willing to listen with something other than just reason. Taking the key into her hands, Elaine turned it over slowly, her eyes catching a worn but unmistakable emblem carved into its base. A marking that sent a bolt of memory through her. It was the logo of a storage facility she had come across during her early research into the case, a location dismissed at the time due to lack of evidence, but one she had always felt deserved another look. And now here it was, suddenly reappearing through the most inexplicable means, and the implications settled over her like a sudden weight on the chest. This wasn't just a clue, it could be the link they had been missing, the physical thread that could tie David Hollis directly to the embezzlement, the fraud, the betrayal that had harmed so many lives. And with her voice now steady and focused, Elaine turned to the court and declared her belief that this key, which had somehow found its way into their hands, was a crucial piece of evidence, one that likely unlocked a private storage unit rented by the defendant under a false name, a place she believed contained documents, records, and hidden truths that Hollis had gone to great lengths to conceal. And though the defense immediately erupted in protest, calling it absurd, grasping at the impossibility of a dog leading them to such a pivotal discovery, Elaine remained calm, her eyes not on them but on the judge, on the jury, on the truth that seemed to be surfacing like a long-buried relic. And in that moment, she felt something unshakable rise inside her, conviction not born from ambition or ego, but from knowing that sometimes justice doesn't arrive neatly arranged in a file folder, but limps in through the back door, tired and overlooked, bearing answers in the most unexpected forms. She presented her reasoning clearly, citing months of investigative threads that had gone cold, unanswered questions about missing assets, untraceable transactions, and the unexplained gaps in Hollis's financial history that had always felt like the doors to a room no one had yet entered, until now, because now, with this key, they finally had a way in. And as she held up the evidence and asked the court for permission to issue a warrant and investigate the storage unit, the courtroom stilled once again, not with disbelief but with anticipation, because even the jury, ordinary people who had likely never imagined they'd witness a moment like this, could sense it too, the shift, the deep sense that something buried was about to rise. And while the defense lawyer scrambled to discredit the request, to remind the court that the origin of the key was irregular at best, Judge Campbell leaned forward, her gaze sharp, focused, not just on procedure now, but on purpose. And after a moment's pause, she granted the motion, and with those words, the course of the trial was altered, not by argument alone, but by a strange, quiet alignment of fate and truth. And as the bailiff escorted Elaine out of the courtroom to execute the warrant with the key held tightly in her hand, she glanced once more at the dog, still silent, still unmoved, its eyes calm and almost knowing. And though she was not someone easily given to metaphor or imagination, she couldn't help but feel that in some way, this creature had known exactly what it was doing, that it had not merely wandered into a courtroom but into the very heart of justice. And in the stillness of that realization, Elaine felt something rarely acknowledged in her world of logic and litigation. She felt awe, not just at the case, but at the fragile, powerful threads that connect intention, truth, and action. Threads that now led her out of the courthouse and toward the locked door of a secret Hollis had worked so hard to bury, and as she rode in silence toward the facility, the key pressing into her palm like a promise, she couldn't shake the quiet certainty blooming in her heart that something sacred had just begun, and no matter what they found inside that storage unit, justice, in some mysterious and beautiful form, had already arrived. As the courtroom doors closed behind Prosecutor Elaine Morgan and the bailiff, the air inside the building seemed to hold its breath, the echo of recent events still trembling through its halls like distant thunder. And outside, beneath a grey sky heavy with quiet tension, Elaine clutched the small, rusted key in her palm, with a grip that was both cautious and reverent, her thoughts racing with 1,000 possibilities, and one single hope that this key, carried into the courtroom by a silent stray who had become the center of a mystery no one could explain, would finally lead them to the truth hidden beneath years of deception. And as their vehicle pulled up to the modest but secured gates of the storage facility on the outskirts of town, the weathered sign overhead, barely legible and mostly forgotten, seemed to whisper secrets of its own. As if it had witnessed more than it ever told, Elaine stepped out with her warrant in hand, met by a wiry old manager, who blinked at her in disbelief when she explained that a dog had brought them a key that could crack open the case of the year. But without question, perhaps sensing the seriousness behind her calm, focused demeanor, he led her and the bailiff down a long, dimly lit corridor, flanked by metal doors, silent sentinels guarding memories and secrets long buried. And as they stopped at Unit 1117, Elaine stared at the lock for a moment, her breath shallow, the key trembling just slightly in her fingers, because this was the moment where speculation ended and reality began. And when she slid the key into the rusted mechanism, it clicked open, with a sound that felt far louder than it should have been, like a verdict spoken by fate itself. Slowly, cautiously, the bailiff pulled the door upward, its groaning echo bouncing off the concrete walls like a warning, and what lay inside made Elaine's breath catch in her throat. Neatly stacked boxes, sealed envelopes, ledgers and records, all meticulously organized with a precision that suggested someone had prepared them for safekeeping, for hiding, perhaps for eventual destruction, but never for discovery. And as the flashlight's beam swept across the space, illuminating names, dates, and logos she recognized from months of financial reports and scattered testimony, the realization struck with sobering clarity. They had found it, the evidence no one thought they'd ever see, the missing link, the hidden chapter, the truth David Hollis had buried so carefully. And as Elaine began to open the first box, the full scope of what she was looking at began to unfold. Bank statements detailing the siphoning of charitable funds, shell company contracts, wire transfers to offshore accounts, even internal memos hinting at hush payments and manipulation of board members, all laid bare in the cool, musty air of that forgotten room. And though her years as a prosecutor had taught her to keep her emotions in check, she couldn't help the quiet tremble in her hands or the sting of tears behind her eyes, as she traced the story written on those pages, not just a tale of greed, but of betrayal of children who would never see the medical funding promised to them, of shelters that had gone under because their grants had vanished, of families who had pinned their hopes on foundations built on nothing but lies. And as she dug deeper into the boxes, page after page, she realized that this wasn't just financial crime, it was a moral wound inflicted on a community, a deep festering betrayal wrapped in the polished image of a man who had smiled for cameras, while signing checks, destined for his own hidden accounts. And standing there among the quiet dust and the cruel evidence, Elaine felt something in her chest that was more than professional satisfaction. It was personal now, because she had spent her life fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. And this room was proof that truth could be hidden, but not forever, not when something as small and strange as a dog could carry a key into a courtroom and change everything. They carefully documented and secured the contents, labeling each piece of evidence with the kind of care one uses when handling fragile things. Because in a way, each item was a fragment of broken trust. And back in the courtroom, As news of the discovery spread like wildfire, the tension grew palpable. Journalists rushed to update headlines, legal analysts scrambled to reinterpret what the trial had become, and Hollis's legal team looked like a fortress under siege, cracks spreading with every whispered update. And yet perhaps most striking of all, was the dog still sitting quietly in the courthouse holding room, now referred to by shelter staff as Justice, resting peacefully with the same calm grace he had entered with, as though he knew his part in the story was complete, that the heavy lifting had been done not with force or words, but with instinct and silent resolve. And Elaine, upon return, glanced at him for a long moment before she spoke, her voice low but resolute as she addressed Judge Campbell and the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have found what we were never supposed to find, and it was this key, this symbol of quiet truth, that opened the door. The documents are not rumors or theories, but facts, hard and undeniable, showing patterns of theft, deception, and cruelty, that paint a picture of a man who cared for nothing but power." And as the boxes of evidence were carried into the courtroom, the jury leaned forward, eyes wide, and even the most skeptical among them began to feel the full weight of the revelation. This wasn't a case anymore, it was a reckoning, and in every flick of a paper, in every carefully labeled file, they saw the true cost of Hollis's crimes, not just in dollars but in dreams, in hope, in people forgotten in the shadows of his empire. And in that heavy silence, as Elaine's voice echoed through the courtroom, and Justice's tail thumped gently against the floor, the truth became undeniable. The key had done more than unlock a door, it had opened a path to justice, lit by the fragile, powerful flame of a truth that refused to stay hidden, no matter how deep the lies, and no matter who tried to bury it.
When Henry Dawson took the witness stand, the courtroom fell into an almost sacred silence, the kind that only settles when something deeply human is about to be shared, something raw, unpolished, and real. And as the retired locksmith adjusted his old spectacles and cleared his throat, no one expected that what would follow would not just be testimony, but a story that would etch itself into the hearts of every person listening. Because Henry, unlike the experts and analysts who had come before him, wasn't there to discuss numbers or timelines or financial statements. He was there to talk about a dog, a silent, dust-covered stray that had arrived at his doorstep one stormy night, like a ghost from another life, carrying nothing but a key, a faded collar, and a pair of eyes that seemed to understand more than any creature should. And as Henry described the moment he first opened his door and saw the animal standing there, soaked to the bone, shivering, but unafraid, the room felt smaller, more intimate, as though everyone had gathered not for a trial but around a fire to hear the kind of tale that reminds people why they feel anything at all. He said he didn't think twice about letting the dog in, because something in the animal's stillness reminded him of a loneliness he'd once known himself, the kind that doesn't come from being alone but from being forgotten. And though Henry lived a quiet, humble life on a farm that had long since stopped being profitable, he knew when someone or something was looking not just for shelter but for understanding. And as the days passed and the dog settled in, sleeping at the foot of his bed, following him through the fields, watching the sunset beside him in the evenings, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose, companionship, and the strange, quiet comfort of being needed. But what made it all the more haunting was what the dog carried with him, that old key tied with string beneath his collar, which Henry at first ignored, thinking it was just left over from some past owner or forgotten walk, until one day he took a closer look and realized the key was one of his own designs, his own work from years ago, from a time when a man named David Hollis had walked into his shop requesting a batch of special keys for a private storage unit. And when Henry shared that revelation with the court, his voice cracked just slightly, because he couldn't understand how this dog, this quiet soul who had healed something broken in him, had come into possession of something that tied directly into the darkest corners of the case at hand. And as he spoke, the jury leaned in, not because the story was sensational, but because it was sincere, a thread of emotion woven through every word. And Judge Campbell, usually stoic, had to glance down at her desk just to steady herself, because what Henry was offering them wasn't just evidence, it was a glimpse into the way life sometimes works in strange, inexplicable ways, how fate doesn't always come with fanfare or logic, but in quiet footsteps and tired eyes, and a loyalty that defies understanding. And Henry, with all his humility and gentle wisdom, said it best when he looked directly at the jurors and said, "That dog didn't find me by mistake. He was looking for someone to listen, someone to trust. And when I found that key, I just knew it was meant for more than just me." And for a long moment after he finished speaking, the courtroom remained quiet, not out of protocol, but because everyone was still processing the weight of what had just been said, the way grief and grace could sit side by side in a single man's story. And in the days that followed, more witnesses came forward. People from across town who had seen the dog wandering, had offered him scraps or shelter, or simply watched him pass with the feeling that he was looking for something, always moving forward with that quiet determination that only the most wounded hearts understand. And one woman, a former shelter volunteer, spoke with tears in her eyes about how the dog had once stayed beside her late husband's grave for 2 nights straight, curled up in the dirt like he was keeping watch. And though no one could explain these stories with certainty, each testimony built upon the last, creating not just a picture of a dog who had been lost, but a soul who had been searching, guided not by instinct alone, but by something great, something almost sacred. And by the end of the week, when Henry returned to the courthouse just to check on the proceedings, the same dog, now named Justice, ran to him without hesitation, wagging his tail and resting his head against the man's leg as if to say, "We did it." And the lawyers, even the reporters, couldn't help but smile through the tears, because this wasn't just about crime and punishment anymore. It was about the quiet heroes we often overlook, the old men who live on forgotten farms, the animals who wander the streets with stories in their eyes, the chance encounters that somehow bring light into the places we thought would always be dark. And in the weeks that followed, Henry's testimony remained one of the most talked about moments in the trial, not because it was the most damning, but because it was the most human reminder that justice is not just about what is fair, but about what is right, and that sometimes the ones who bring truth to light are not the loudest voices in the room, but the ones who have walked quietly through pain, carrying keys to doors no one else knew were locked, waiting patiently for someone to be brave enough to turn them.
The days that followed Henry Dawson's haunting testimony felt different in the courtroom. Quieter, heavier, as if something unseen had shifted in the air, as if everyone was beginning to sense that this case, already strange and stirring, held more secrets than anyone had imagined. And it was during one of those heavy, late afternoons that prosecutor Elaine Morgan, sitting in her office, surrounded by papers, photos, and clippings, received an anonymous email that would deepen the mystery surrounding the dog they now affectionately called Justice. The email was short, just a few lines, but its contents struck like lightning. "Justice isn't just a stray. Look into Hollis's estate records. You'll find the dog was trained by him." At first, Elaine stared at the screen, unsure whether to believe it, whether to give weight to a message with no signature, no source. But something about the timing, the phrasing, the certainty of it, unsettled her, and so she followed the lead, tracing public records, archived employee logs, and eventually, with the help of a persistent intern named Ava, uncovered a long-forgotten connection, buried deep in the files of a now-defunct private security company, once owned by none other than David Hollis. And then, tucked within pages of personnel files and equipment lists, was the name, Max, along with a photograph, grainy and old, but unmistakable. It was Justice, younger, stronger, eyes alert and focused, wearing the training harness of a K9 unit. Elaine felt the breath leave her body as the realization settled in. Justice wasn't a random miracle, not a stray, guided by instinct alone, but a dog with a history, a past tied directly to the very man, now on trial for betrayal and deceit. And as she read through the records, notations about obedience drills, retrieval exercises, high response behavior, it became clear that Justice had once been trained to serve, to obey, to protect property, people, secrets. The twist wasn't just ironic, it was devastatingly poetic, because now the courtroom had not just a symbolic figure of loyalty, but a living, breathing reminder of how even the most discarded, unwanted lives could rise again to do what was right. And as Elaine presented her findings to the court, the room went still again, not with shock this time, but with awe, as jurors and spectators alike listened to how Hollis had once owned several trained dogs through a private contract with an elite facility, dogs purchased to guard his assets, trained to follow commands without hesitation. And then when one of them failed to perform on a mission,
He had him abandoned, marked as defective, and left to wander the world alone. Justice, once known as Max, had likely spent years searching for belonging, for purpose, unaware that the man who cast him aside would one day sit on trial while he, the forgotten, would bring the truth to light. And this revelation, delivered through paperwork, testimony from a former handler, and confirmation from the training facility's archived database, did more than just complicate the case. It broke something open, something deeply emotional, because now the courtroom wasn't just watching a dog uncover secrets. They were watching a soul return to confront its past. Silent witness, forced to face the very man who had once deemed him worthless. And though justice could not speak, could not testify, his presence now meant more than ever, because every step he took in that courtroom was no longer just symbolic. It was deeply personal. And when Henry Dorse, upon learning of the dog's past, knelt beside him and whispered, "I'm so sorry they did that to you," even the bailiff looked away, eyes shimmering, because it wasn't just a story of legal justice anymore. It was a story of redemption, of how those we discard, those we forget, those we leave behind, can rise from the dust of their old lives and do something extraordinary. And Elaine, addressing the court, said it best when she looked at the jury and asked, "What does it say about the heart of a man who trains animals to serve him, then abandons them when they falter? And what does it say about the soul of a dog, who despite it all, comes back not with anger, but with truth?" Her voice was calm but filled with passion, and her words struck a chord so deep that jurors began to look not just at justice, but at each other, as if something larger than law was being called into the room. And in the days that followed, this revelation became the emotional turning point of the trial, the part where the lines between fact and feeling blurred, where the jury stopped seeing the case as just a tangle of numbers and timelines, and began to feel the weight of every betrayal, not just of stolen money, but of trust, of loyalty, of innocent creatures used and discarded. And even the press, so often focused on headlines, began reporting not just on the trial, but on the strange, almost mythical return of a dog who had once been trained to protect a criminal empire, and now, unknowingly or not, had helped bring it to its knees. And for Henry, the news changed something too, not in how he treated justice, for that love had already been earned, but in how he saw him now, not just as a companion, but as a survivor, a being who had endured abandonment and found his way back to purpose. And on quiet nights, after long court sessions, Henry would sit with him on the porch, running his fingers gently through his fur, whispering stories and songs like prayers, while the old dog lay at his feet, eyes soft with the kind of understanding no human could ever fully grasp. The town, too, began to change. People came by the shelter to ask about the dog. Children drew pictures of him for their classrooms, and a local paper published an editorial titled, "Justice, the Dog Who Remembered." And while no one could ever truly explain how he had found the key, or why he had entered the courtroom that day, those questions became less important than the answer his presence gave to a much bigger question. Can something once broken, once forgotten, once betrayed, ever find its way back to meaning? And justice, once abandoned, had answered that question, not with words but with quiet footsteps and unwavering loyalty, showing the world that yes, healing is possible, that even in the shadows of our worst mistakes, redemption waits patiently for the light to return. And when it does, it sometimes comes on four legs, with a past full of sorrow and a future bright with purpose.
The shift was subtle at first, like the faint scent of rain before a storm, but soon it became undeniable. The tide in the courtroom was turning, and with every passing hour the walls David Hullis had built around his secrets began to crack and crumble under the relentless weight of truth. And though he still sat in his chair with a carefully composed expression, anyone watching closely could see the signs, the tightening of his jaw, the twitch in his fingers, the way he no longer met anyone's gaze for too long. And what began as a single key around a stray dog's neck had now become a flood of damning evidence, rising steadily and mercilessly, pulling every lie and act of cruelty he had committed into the light. It started with the documents, boxes and boxes of them, each page a quiet accusation, each signature a nail in the coffin of the carefully crafted image Hullis had spent years building. And as prosecutor Elaine Morgan stood before the court, her voice clear and calm, she walked the jury through transaction after transaction, donations re-rated, charity funds funneled into offshore accounts, budgets stripped bare under false pretenses, and behind every number was a story, a face, a community that had been robbed, not just of money, but of hope, And then came the emails, unearthed by her young assistant Ava, who had spent sleepless nights combing through servers and digital archives, and what they revealed was more than just mismanagement. It was a pattern of exploitation so cold and calculated that it made the air in the courtroom feel heavier. There were messages where Hollis mocked the very people he claimed to help, notes to staff instructing them to shred documents, just in case, conversations where he laughed about how easy it was to manipulate donors with photos of children and promises of change he never intended to keep. And as the jury read these aloud, the disbelief on their faces turned to something sharper, something colder: anger, betrayal, that heavy mix of sorrow and rage reserved for those who had not just broken the law, but broken faith. The final blow, though, came from surveillance footage, grainy but damning, showing Hollis arriving late at the storage facility, often alone, sometimes under the cover of night, unloading boxes and looking over his shoulder before disappearing behind the steel doors. And Elaine played the footage in court, with barely a word, letting the images speak for themselves, letting the truth settle into the silence between gasps and murmurs. And even Judge Campbell, seasoned and stern, leaned back in her chair, her face pale, her hands still as stone, because this wasn't just about numbers or violations anymore. This was about character, about a man who had lived two lives, one for the cameras and one for himself. And in the middle of it all sat Justice, the dog who had started it, now lying at Henry Dawson's feet, calm as ever, his eyes watching with the quiet wisdom of someone who had already seen too much. His old fingers resting gently on the dog's back, whispered now and then as if reassuring him, as if saying, "They see it now, boy, they finally see it." And the courtroom, which had once doubted the relevance of the dog's arrival, now understood fully that it had been the first unmasking, the first moment the truth had dared to walk into the room uninvited. And as Elaine delivered her final round of evidence, purchase orders for trained K9 units, records of payments to Hush former employees, receipts from shell companies all traced back to Hollis, she paused only once, placing her hand on the final file and looking out over the jury, her voice no longer just that of a prosecutor, but of someone who had carried the weight of this case like a stone in her chest. And she said simply, "This wasn't just theft, it was a betrayal of every person who ever trusted him." And the truth didn't come from a whistleblower or a press leak. It came from a dog he trained, used, abandoned, and forgot. And now that same soul has brought us everything he tried to bury. And in that moment the room went still again, but not with doubt, with clarity, with resolve, because the story was no longer in pieces, it was whole, and every part of it, from the cold wire transfers to the shaky camera footage, to the soulful brown eyes of the dog at the center of it all, painted a picture not just of corruption, but of cruelty, and how far a man could fall when he stopped seeing people, animals, even justice itself, as anything more than tools to serve his ambition. And Hollis, hearing those words, looked not at the jury or the judge, but at Justice, and something in his face broke, a crack of recognition, that perhaps somewhere deep down he understood that this moment was inevitable, that no lie lasts forever, and that truth, no matter how quiet or how long it takes, always finds its way home. And when the judge called for a recess, the room exhaled as one, people rising from their seats not with relief but with weight, the weight of having seen a man unmasked, and a forgotten creature, become a symbol. And outside the courthouse, the world waited, cameras ready, reporters breathless, because the story they had once treated as unusual had become something else entirely, an echo of justice long overdue, brought forward not by force, but by a tail-wagging messenger, with a past he never chose, and a future he had unknowingly shaped. And in the days to come, as the trial neared its conclusion, everyone knew one thing with certainty: the tide had turned, and there was no going back.
The air inside the courtroom was so still. It felt as though time had paused, just long enough for every soul in the room to feel the gravity of what was about to unfold. After weeks of tense testimonies, shocking revelations, and emotional moments that had left the walls themselves soaked with truth, the time had come for the final chapter, the climactic moment when the question that had haunted every minute of this trial would be answered. And as the jury filed back into the room, eyes serious, movements careful, you could feel it. Something sacred,
settling into the space between breaths, the weight of justice preparing to speak. David Hollis sat at the defense table, his once confident demeanor now a fragile mask barely holding back the dread beneath. And though he tried to appear composed, the trembling in his fingers as they gripped the edge of the table betrayed him, and beside him, his lawyer sat still, lips pressed into a tight line, knowing that no closing argument, no last-minute objection could stop what was coming, because the evidence had been too heavy, too precise, too human to ignore. Numbers that bled, emails that echoed with cruelty, and the silent, steadfast presence of a dog who had become the soul of the trial. Prosecutor Elaine Morgan stood with her arms crossed lightly, not with triumph, but with the quiet reserve of a woman who had carried not just a case but a cause through the fire. And when the judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict, the foreperson, an older woman with silver hair and kind but serious eyes, rose with a folded slip of paper in her hand, her voice trembling as she answered, "Yes, Your Honor, we have." And the courtroom seemed to stop breathing as the bailiff took the paper and passed it to Judge Campbell, who unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the verdict, her face giving nothing away. And then she looked up, voice strong and clear, and read the words that would end it all. In the matter of the state versus David Hollis, on the charges of fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy and obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. And in that moment, a wave of emotion surged through the room like a great tide returning to shore after years lost at sea. There was no applause, no outburst, just a collective release of breath, of tension, of grief and relief, mixed so tightly together, they became one. And Hollis, for the first time, slumped back in his seat as if the words themselves had taken the last of his strength. His hands falling limp on the table, his face pale, lost, exposed, not just as a criminal, but as a man who had spent a lifetime weaving lies that had finally unraveled before the world. Elaine closed her eyes for a moment, not in celebration, but in mourning, for the lives harmed, for the children whose futures were stolen, for the communities left in darkness, while Hollis grew rich. And she turned to look at Justice, who was curled up peacefully beside Henry Dawson's feet, and as their eyes met, her lips formed a soft smile, one of gratitude, of wonder, because this wasn't just a legal victory, it was something much more profound, something deeply human, deeply hopeful. Henry wiped a tear from his cheek as he leaned down to stroke the old dog's head, whispering words only Justice could hear, and around them people wept quietly, jurors who had carried the burden of truth through sleepless nights, reporters who had begun the trial, skeptical, but now felt changed, even the court staff who had come to love the sight of the dog, who walked these halls like he belonged here, because he did, not just as a witness, but as a reminder that even the forgotten, the abandoned, the silent, can carry the truth with them until someone is brave enough to listen. And Judge Campbell, who had seen thousands of cases in her time on the bench, sat for a moment longer before she spoke, her voice softer now, more personal, as she looked directly at Hollis and said, "This court finds not just guilt in your actions, Mr. Hollis, but tragedy in the choices that brought you here. You had power, and instead of using it to help, you used it to harm. And in the end, the justice you feared came not from a courtroom, but from a dog you left behind." And with that, she struck the gavel once, firmly, and declared the trial concluded. And though the sound echoed with finality, what lingered in its wake was not the end, but the beginning of healing. Outside the courtroom, the world had gathered, cameras flashing, voices rising with questions and headlines. But inside, the mood remained tender, sacred, as if everyone knew that they had witnessed something rare, something that would be told and retold for years, not because of its sensational details, but because of its soul, because truth had arrived, not with spectacle, but with humility, walking on four legs and carrying a rusted key that opened more than just a storage unit. It opened hearts, opened wounds, opened the door to justice. And as Elaine stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, her eyes swept across the crowd not with pride, but with peace, and she simply said, "Justice is more than a verdict. It's a choice, one we must make, again and again, for those who cannot speak, for those who are forgotten, for those like him, and she gestured gently toward Henry, who stood with Justice by his side, the old man's eyes shining with love, his hand resting on the head of a dog who had wandered through loss, through silence, through memory, and had emerged not broken, but whole, a quiet hero in a world that had nearly left him behind. And now, he was more than a witness, more than a symbol. He was the reminder that no matter how deep the betrayal, how long the lie, the truth will always find its way back home.
In the quiet days that followed the thunderous verdict, something beautiful began to unfold, slowly at first like the thaw after a long, bitter winter, as the town, still reeling from the darkness uncovered during the trial, began to shift its gaze not just to the man who had been found guilty, but to the quiet, four-legged soul who had changed everything, because long after the courtroom had emptied and the files were sealed away in cabinets, the name that remained on everyone's lips wasn't Hollis. It was Justice, the once forgotten dog who had wandered into a courtroom and ended up lighting a path not just to truth, but to something deeper, something that people didn't always talk about, but longed for desperately: redemption. And not just for the guilty, but for the community, for the hurt, for the people who had almost given up on believing that good could still rise from brokenness. And in grocery stores and barbershops, at town meetings and schoolyards, stories about justice began to spread, others grown taller with retelling, but all of them wrapped in the kind of affection that small towns reserve for their most unlikely heroes. And at the center of it all was Henry Dawson, the quiet locksmith with weathered hands and a heart too big to fit inside his aging chest, who now found himself approached by neighbors, strangers, even children, asking to meet the dog, who had not only helped bring down a criminal empire, but had also reminded everyone what loyalty truly looked like. And justice, for all the attention, remained unchanged, still padding quietly through the fields beside Henry's farmhouse, still sleeping curled at the foot of Henry's bed, still sitting with his head tilted in the same soft way when someone spoke to him, as if he understood every word and carried each one in his soul. But even though he never sought the spotlight, it followed him, and soon enough the local paper named him hometown hero, followed by a feature on the regional news, and then an outpouring of letters, drawing even donations from across the state, began to flood the shelter that had once taken him in, sparking a movement that would come to be known as Justice's Legacy, a community initiative spearheaded by Elaine Morgan and Henry together, aimed at helping abandoned animals, funding vet clinics, and supporting elderly residents who could no longer care for their pets, but didn't want to say goodbye. And through it all, Justice was there, sometimes riding in the passenger seat of Henry's old pickup truck, his nose pressed to the wind, sometimes sitting quietly beside a child reading to him during library story hour, sometimes visiting the courtroom just to remind the people there that justice isn't always cold or procedural. It can be soft, it can have fur and warm eyes and carry no bitterness at all. Schools began inviting Henry and Justice to speak at assemblies, and though Henry never thought of himself as a public speaker, he found his voice in the stories he told, not of laws or trials, but of storms and second chances, of how he found justice at his door on a night that had felt like the end, and discovered it was only the beginning. And there wasn't a dry eye in the room when he would say, with a hand resting on the dog's back, he didn't just find a key, he found a way to unlock all of it. And the children, listening with wide eyes, didn't just learn about crime or courage, they learned about kindness, about the power of one small act to change a life. Because if a dog no one wanted could help uncover the truth and mend a broken man's heart, then surely they too could do something that mattered. And so the story lived on, not just as a legal victory, but as a symbol carried in the quiet rituals of daily life, in the family that adopted an older shelter dog, in the teenager who volunteered to clean cages on weekends, in the woman who forgave her neighbor after years of silence, saying softly, "If that dog could forgive what was done to him, maybe I can too." And the town, once burdened by scandal, found itself healing not through grand gestures, but through small kindnesses inspired by the simplest of heroes. Even Judge Campbell, known for her unwavering formality, kept a photo of Justice framed on her desk, not for publicity, but because she said he reminded her of something she'd nearly forgotten. In all her years on the bench,
that justice without compassion is only half a truth, and it was that balance, the law and the heart, that justice had restored, simply by being who he was, and Elaine, who had thrown herself into the case with the fire of someone who had seen too much wrong go unpunished, found in the aftermath not just peace but purpose, turning her efforts to advocacy, bringing justice's legacy to other towns, to other forgotten places where neglected voices needed a champion. And every time someone asked her how it all began, she would smile, not with arrogance but with quiet gratitude, and say, it started with a key and a dog that wouldn't quit, and they would listen, and they would believe, because the truth of it wasn't just in the story, it was in the feeling it left behind, a kind of warmth that stayed with you long after the tale had ended. And as seasons passed, and the years rolled forward, the town didn't forget, not because of newspaper articles or awards, but because the story had become part of who they were, a legend, not of war or wealth, but of loyalty and love, and the belief that no matter how lost something seems, it can still come home, still find light, still do good. And late at night on the porch of that farmhouse where it all began, Henry would sip his tea as justice lay at his feet, the stars stretching overhead like a silent choir, and sometimes he'd whisper to the dog, "You saved more than you know, buddy. You gave this place its heart back." And justice, ever still, ever knowing, would lift his eye, and in that simple look was all the proof anyone ever needed, that redemption is real, that love leaves a legacy, and that even the smallest act, the smallest soul, can change the world in ways no one could ever predict.